Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I am joined by a very bright, not so young man. I don't know, these days it's hard to, in my old age, in my dotage, it's very difficult to describe what's young or not. In any event, I am joined today by Flimflamm, a very dubious name for a otherwise highly regarded individual. We're going to be talking about complex systems, narrow and broad specialization, and or the Renaissance man versus the specialist. Those of you who know German might know the term Fachidiot, literally the subject idiot. And eventually get into the pitfalls, benefits, and limitations of the free market. I am confident we can somehow link all of those. In particular, the former two, because knowledge is very much an emergent property, as we'll get into. With that said, I think I will, although I could probably do it myself, I will hand over the podium to Flimflamm of the dubious name to introduce the topic of complex systems, and from there we will launch into knowledge, specialization, narrowness, etc. So thank you for joining me, and I know you're very eager to talk about complex systems, so here's your opportunity.
Greetings, and thanks for the introduction. So I guess we'll get right into it. What is a complex system, for those who may not know? We can define it as basically a very large system that has many fundamental or basic parts that follow basic rules of interaction. A good example of a complex system is many gas particles bouncing around in a room. We can model the average behavior of gas in a room, but we can't exactly predict what each molecule will be doing. So what happens in complex systems, in some of them, over time and over scale, self-repeating patterns of behavior emerge, and from these, essentially, hierarchies of interactions are built. So let me try and think of an example. All biological systems are essentially complex in nature. They have very basic parts that interact in complex ways that form networks. These networks themselves form complex systems upon which higher forms of complexity emerge. There are many examples of this, but just to give a kind of brief summary, the behavior of these emergent phenomenon within complex systems is non-linear. And what we mean by non-linear is that when we see new emergent patterns come about, they behave in novel ways that may not reflect anything about the basic fundamental parts which constitute them. So predicting what will emerge in a complex system is almost impossible, basically because there's too many interactions, too many parts of the network. The precision with which we would need to measure the network would be immense, and the complexity of the network itself would limit our ability to actually model or understand it.
Right. I think one example of an emergent property, you could say, is the ecosystem with its various interactions, dependencies, etc. Ostensibly it appears linear, but it's not. So you have different types of animals, they fall within a food chain, and you have plants, then you have meteorological phenomena, then you have the actual climate of the place overall, and all of this essentially is an ecosystem is an emergent property in as much as many small parts make up a greater whole, and it's nonlinear. Well, this would be one example I could cite.
Yeah, exactly, and a great example of how ecosystems can be nonlinear when wolves were exterminated in certain parts of the country, the deer population exploded. In certain valleys, the result of the exploding deer population is that they were able to eat almost all of the small shrubs that were growing on the hillside and on the riverbank. The result of no shrubs is that there's nowhere for small rodents to hide, and there's lots of soil erosion. The water, or the soil, just doesn't retain the water as well. Less things grow overall. So when wolves were reintroduced, they took care of the excess deer. The shrubs were able to grow on the ground, which could then retain water and then support much greater diversity of life.
Yeah, I just briefly, I don't want to, as someone who in my youth aspired to be a zoologist, as a Canuckian yourself, has there been somewhere in the east? I mean, yeah, wolves were extirpated basically throughout North America, with a few exceptions: Minnesota, northern Michigan, parts of Canada, obviously mostly in the west. Has there been an active campaign to reintroduce wolves in eastern Canada?
I happen to live on a peninsula, so not so much where I'm at, but in some of the northern parks, yes. We are trying to find the right balance of all these complex competing factors. We don't exactly know what the ideal balance is, but generally nature had already had it figured out fairly well. So,
of course, I don't want to jump the gun here and move ahead ourselves, but there are these issues. There are these issues related to reintroduction of wolf populations, which basically throughout the Western world, most places wolves are extirpated. And where you have farmer concerns and rancher concerns. So, for example, the same issues presented themselves in Scotland and to a lesser extent in England, and that wolves haven't been around in Great Britain for centuries. But no, I don't think very few. There are ideas toying with that, reintroducing it, but one of the problems with complex systems is we now have a complex system involving the economy, and then you enter into sort of, you could almost say, contradictory circumstances, whereby you have economic interests which are represented in farmers and ranchers and people who would generally balk at the idea of the reintroduction of a wolf population in certain areas, particularly a small area like Scotland or England, or Ireland for that matter. And then you have sort of environmental ecosystem arguments, such as the one you made. The same case in New York State, where I was originally from. The white-tailed deer population is completely out of control and has been for decades and decades. I have not heard any talk of reintroducing wolves there. So you have this conflict of interest because the economy itself is a complex system, and it's a new factor, and there's no linearity there either, because centuries ago obviously there were people raised livestock and wolves were concerned. In fact, that was one of the major reasons for getting rid of them. But it's one of those things that has become even more complex. No pun intended.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When you have two complex systems that collide, I mean, you have an even more complex system, and you have a lot of destruction on both sides. Yep. You have a lot of man destroying nature and a lot of unintended ramifications that are harming our own complex systems, like markets and corporations, our ability to be economically productive. Climate change, I guess, is probably the big example of that. So we have all these knobs in a complex system that we could turn, like the wolf population or the deer. Like, do we allow deer culling? Excuse me. And we can't predict what the effect of turning any of these knobs really will be. We can make educated guesses, and we can test things out and create heuristics for what might be good, but ultimately there's too much irreducible complexity to really make a science out of it.
I'm sorry, when you said that, I had to think 2003, 4, 5 with intelligent design, but yeah. And here's the funny thing about complex systems is you can actually, I think, get to the bottom of a complex system through reductionist reasoning, in as much as you can tease out the basic bits and parts. As you're pointing out, though, it's absolutely correct that the basic bits and parts will not explain the final emergent product in perfection, and the best we can come up with are these sort of approximations or relative heuristic models.
I mean, you're right. We can take a reductionist perspective. The problem is getting to the bottom of these complex systems is so difficult in the first place. And so have you ever heard of the game of life? The simulation?
Well, I'm familiar with life history theory and
So this is just basically a simple computer program that creates a system of like a grid of blocks, and it defines really basic rules. The rule is, if a block is adjacent to two other blocks that have a 1 in them, then that block will have a 1. And if there are 3 blocks, then it'll have a 0. And if there's 1 block, it'll have a 0. If there's 4 blocks, it'll have a 0. And so you create a random arrangement of 1s and 0s on this grid, and then allow the system to iterate following those basic rules for each block. And very quickly you get spontaneous and unpredictable. Well, I guess you can predict it because we run the simulation, but it's hard to imagine beforehand, before we run the simulation, the interactions which actually happen. We do see some complex structures start to emerge, even in a very simple system. And if you're a viewer, you can actually just Google the game of life, and you should be able to find an online simulator pretty quickly. But the initial state of the system is entirely sensitive to what the outcome will be. So if you change the initial state of that system just a little bit, then what results in the end, many iterations down the line, can be drastically different. And so that's one of the other heuristical problems or epistemic problems of trying to understand complex systems when we don't have the fundamental rules of the simulation to begin with.
Yeah. And, now that we sort of covered the basics of complex systems, I think it's very pertinent and very much related to the main issue we wanted to talk about, which was specialization, narrow specialization versus broad knowledge. Now, this is it's complex, both in the specific sense we mean in the general sense, but it comes to mind. Well, two things come to mind: the old phrase, "the Renaissance man." This was something in my youth. I'm a bit older. Well, actually, quite a bit older. That I strove for formerly in my life. Eventually, gave it up for reasons we'll get into. And then the other phrase, "jack of all trades," which is then always completed by master of none, or perhaps it's not always completed, but. And we tend to look at these men of greatness of former times who seem to be able to do everything. The Leonardo da Vinci is, to a lesser extent, because he's mostly an artist. People such as Tesla. Well, Tesla's a bit too modern, actually, and I think he's a bit overrated. But various personalities from back in the day.
Newton.
Although I don't want to get too much into this, I think Newton was a very limited person. If you actually look at the evidence, I support Leibniz for discovering calculus, and Leibniz was just much more productive in terms of he was much more of a Renaissance man. I think Newton was much more of a specialist. But I don't want to get into that debate. I've had it a couple of times already. Maybe I'll make a video about it one day. Why Leibniz is
Oh, sorry, I did mean to say Newton was a specialist.
Oh, yes, of course he was. Whereas Leibniz was, he was more of a Renaissance man. Newton was, we could call him, I guess, a subject idiot, and translated from the German. But these men lived at a time when it was pretty easy to be well endowed if you were smart enough. That's a prerequisite, obviously. Knowledge from various fields. So maybe in the 17th century, you could have been a botanist, a physicist, a mathematician, a writer, a poet. These were not, I hate to use the term mutually exclusive, and they're not. They're all somehow related, maybe with the exception of poetry. But there wasn't that depth of knowledge. Now we fast forward to the current year, as they like to say. I mean, it's
impossible for any one person to be.
It's not even enough. A good example would be, say, molecular biology. It's not even. You can't. I mean, you can say you're a molecular biologist, but then there's subfields within subfields of molecular biology, and it's just there's no way you could possibly be a quote-unquote Renaissance man. And I've encountered these people, very bright people who, it's almost, sometimes I'm almost at a loss. I remember encountering some people some years ago who, one was I guess you could call a bot. There was a couple. One was a female. She was a researcher at Caltech and in molecular biology, and I don't recall which subfield, and then her boyfriend who was involved in physics, and they're all just they all they did was that really narrow thing. They couldn't talk about anything else. They weren't very articulate, but they knew that one thing, and they were good at it, presumably, if it'd be Caltech. I think that, like anything, the narrowing of knowledge comes with losses and gains. It's inarguable that we cannot comprehend the world today and make progress without that narrowing, because it's just we know so much more than we used to. And if you want to quantify that, let's say in the time of Newton or Leibniz, there were maybe 1,000 things you needed to learn to be a general good scientist in a variety of fields. Well, now there are probably, and I'm just guessing, millions and millions of things within one field, and then even more, and perhaps fewer, but substantially more in a subfield. So, are you going to be a particle physicist? Are you going to be a nuclear physicist? Are you going to be an astrophysicist? I mean, it's just too bloody difficult. So, with that sort of differentiation made, and the fortunate or unfortunate circumstances we're living in, what are your thoughts on this being almost an inevitable necessity of narrow specialization?
I think that we are definitely trending there. It's undeniable that as the scientific body of knowledge grows, we need specialists kind of on site in order to be autonomous on their own, in order to actually advance the field. You can't have a general, Newton or one of the Renaissance men of old maybe was able to advance many sciences with powerful general intelligence, but nowadays you literally have to be completely focused. I think that there's actually reason to believe that biologically we're trending toward people who are better at being specialized rather than having specific intelligence rather than general intelligence, to put it like that. In our evolutionary history, we were all doing generally the same things. We were hunting, gathering, doing agriculture. We didn't need to have rigidly specific skill sets. As society began to evolve, we began to create more niches for people to fill. So it is entirely possible that there are strong evolutionary selection factors that have been pushing us towards narrow intelligence. That may even be one of the reasons why we've been able to suddenly come up with science, or have had the rapid progress that we have. Taking an even deeper look at it, specific and general intelligence really goes back to kind of early theories of intelligence. The G factor is the general intelligence, and the S factor is specific intelligence. So we've been aware of this for quite some time. The most interesting examples of narrow intelligence that we can find, or in my opinion, are actually machine learning AIs. And what those basically are inspired and artificial neural networks that feed in mass amounts of data, run some sort of algorithm in an artificially created complex network that's able to grow and revise itself based on feedback from outputs. And so these machine learning programs are literally growing kind of emergent phenomenon across these neural networks that happen to correspond to factors inherent in the data that we're feeding them. So if we give it a problem that's like classify these two sets of dots, it slowly tries things and improves itself over time. How that actually works is at each node in the network, each neuron is acting autonomously, and out of that slowly emerges the correct understanding. The best example of general intelligence that we have, I would say, is the human mind itself. We have no machine can compare to the human mind. No other animal can compare to the human mind. We don't have AI that can do common sense reasoning. We have AI that can only do the specific task we literally train it for and program it to do. We can learn very quickly, whereas narrow intelligence AI require massive amounts of data. We can do abstract reasoning and use abstract reasoning to perform tasks correctly the first time that we've never even encountered before.
And so, briefly interject that this, I should point out that general intelligence is manifested in the human mind comes at a large cost, because the vast majority of us, there are all sorts of reasons why this is the case, but one of the reasons is if you have a general intelligence versus a narrow intelligence, I'd say 99% of the time, in the vast majority of cases, the narrow intelligence at that specific task will beat out the general intelligence. Or, for example, doing I don't like to use the term complex calc, but sort of massive calculations, such as what is 3,957,000.53 to the 13th power. I mean, there's one guy I can think about, John von Neumann, who could have done that possibly, but the vast majority couldn't do that. Whereas a pocket calculator, which is a solar-powered pocket calculator, an example of a narrow intelligence.
Very, very narrow.
Yeah, could do that. And so this, I see where we're going. Maybe where we're going with this is that the heights of intelligence. So we say G loadedness, to use the term, seem to be independent of the general, and almost necessarily have to be narrow, with very few exceptions. I like to use the analogy of various computer parts working together to form the computer. And if any one of these parts, so for example, let's say, by way of analogy, you have a human being, and all of us have various strengths and weaknesses. I would argue that, for example, in my case, my RAM is terrible. my random access memory. So I have pretty good long-term memory. My short-term memory is atrocious. But even if my CPU is the equivalent of the best out in the market, and you could say that the GPU would be your ability to articulate ideas or something like that.
Mm.
If your RAM isn't keeping up with the rest of it, there's going to be a deficiency. As in my case, where I have many deficiencies, It's one of them. There's again, I have to bring up John von Neumann because I think he probably was the smartest guy, at least in the 20th century. Do you know John von Neumann?
I do not.
Okay, he pioneered game theory. He came up with MAD, mutually assured destruction. He worked on the A-bomb. He did a lot of stuff. It's said of him, he had a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and I don't think, I'm not one for hearsay, but he said that we're all fucking stupid compared to him. He was able to do those types of calculations in his head, the one I just cited, and then a brief anecdotal example would be he had read, I think, The Tale of Two Cities, some work by Charles Dickens, 15, 20 years prior, and he could, from memory, from his RAM cite, just read off word for word what the first 5 pages were, with the words, the lines written there. English wasn't even his first language, Hungarian was. That is, that's kind of as much as you can get the pinnacle. You could argue where all of the hardware involved in the human computational process and arrangement is optimized, but most of us are running these sort of these misaligned hardware components. Now, for narrow intelligence, you don't need all of that. You don't necessarily. You can really just have one really it's not a perfect analogy, but one optimized piece of hardware that does one thing, and that's good enough. And so, barring one exception I can think of off the top of my head, I don't know if that kind of, we'll call it a superintelligence for the purposes of discussion, the superintelligence is achievable without the loss of the general intelligence, because again, I've encountered many of these specialists, I'm using that term in a nice way, who, they can talk about their field. I've met lots of my interest in this molecular, talk about their specific interest in botanic molecular biology and nothing else, and otherwise they just appear as smooth brains, effectively. And I think this is a real obstacle to progress in general. It might just be a hardwired limitation of our universe, or of human beings in the universe. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
So, you are almost completely right. Like, there is a distinct trade-off between special or specific and general intelligence. Just to give a brief evolutionary perspective, again, in the old days when we had very simple and general things to do, like hunt and fish, we were all on our own. We needed general intelligence, but now in our society of many niches, we actually have the support network that it's more valuable to have many specialists who are all specialized in many different fields, and them supporting each other as a community gets way more done. Regarding narrow and general intelligence within humans, this may be a little controversial, and it is kind of on the cusp of the research in the field, but autism brings up good evidence that we are trending towards more specific intelligence, and that autism itself, what we can see about the topology of a brain of someone who has autism versus someone who does not, or someone who has the inverse condition, and almost make kind of convincing approximations about what that means. So, for instance, someone who has autism has generally shorter connections like the average distance of connections between neurons in their brain tends toward local connections rather than long distance connections. They have very increased sensory and kind of visual spatial abilities. So they have very increased memory and attentional focus. And so, thinking about this a little bit abstractly, how I interpret that to mean is that local models build in the brain rather than having global or interconnected models that are more suitable for abstract reasoning or general intelligence. A really interesting thing to note is that schizophrenia appears to be somewhat of a diametrically opposed condition to autism. Rather than having strengthened local connections, they have weakened local connections. And so on average, the longer connections are more influential. I know from looking into evolutionary theories about why schizophrenia may be prevalent, is that back in our tribal days they would kind of play the role of a shaman. They would come up with these grand narratives and interpretations of everything. I mean, it's a kind of use. I'm not exactly sure if a schizotypal or schizophrenic mind today really is a good example of too much general intelligence. But what we do know is that we want an optimal balance between local and long-range connections. And when we have too much of one, then we get unpredictable dysregulation of the whole system.
Yeah, a good example in the case of autism is genuinely autist. I mean, increasingly the term autist is an internet term, which, as I think if the audience doesn't know, internet autism is not the same thing as official autism, but actual autism. Even high functioning autists tend to lack in what you could call social intelligence. You could argue that social intelligence is very much a general form of intelligence because it works on cues and interconnectedness and all these things that would, in some sense, exclude somebody with that type of brain structure topology, and it comes at a cost. If the high-functioning or low-functioning autist, for better or worse, can do certain things, perform amazing visuospatial tasks, but has no sense of social awareness whatsoever. That is, as you pointed out, definitely a trend in a certain direction. And maybe, and I'm just completely speculating, that maybe in some sense there has been a selection pressure in the past century or so to move towards that direction because it lends itself. Well, this is a difficult one. I mean, it doesn't really lend itself to DNA replication. But go on.
I mean, it can indirectly. Newton benefits his society overall, but there is actually evidence that autism correlates with parents who do have high IQ, who are more intelligent in the sense of what it means to be intelligent today. So that could mean being able to fill a very specific niche. It might not mean being having the best social skills. I think arguably you need social skills less and less in a world that has these rigid niches that you can fill. If you can be a scientist,
the internet, right?
That's a very good point. And there are a lot of correlates between having a high IQ and autism. Large brains, fast brain growth. Already mentioned the memory and the sensory, like the things seem more drastic. Your senses, light is brighter, or there's more tend to have interest in physical sciences and engineering, and also it's called assortative mating, which
I've made an entire video about assortative mating, actually. So
interesting. I didn't see that.
I'll link it to you after the talk if you're interested.
Yeah. So if you are already intelligent, you want to mate with somebody who's more intelligent, and that's a very good. If intelligence today is the ability to select for these particular, or to fill these particular niches very well, better than a general intelligence could, then maybe that does mean, for instance, shorter connections in the topology of the brain on average, and too much of that in the evolutionary dice rolls as we trend more towards what is optimum. The rise in severe or genuine autism may be just the upper end of the bell curve, as it were. And where if you have too short of connections, then that kind of breaks down the regulation of the whole system. And so you have these very specific intelligence, these subject idiots, who can be very good who can have eidetic memories, who can have savant-like abilities, but also be utterly lacking in certain other aspects of normal human
the technical
cognition.
term we use in English, I believe, is idiot savant. But I like subject idiot more. Yeah, so the idiot savant and or subject. The problem here is that purely in terms of evolution, I would agree that social intelligence is becoming overall of lesser importance, but if you wish to mate and propagate your DNA, that this will still, in most cases, be of some concern. So, for example, the vast majority, speaking of women will not be attracted to the typical idiot savant, if only because he's socially completely inept. He might be really good at, I don't know, revolutionizing particle physics or whatever it is he might be doing, or set theory, but that he can't do anything else. That is not going to be an attractive prospect. And I think this is also related to something you brought up earlier, that in former times, Neolithic period, etc., general intelligence was the way to go, and was the property that women found well, not in and of itself. Women aren't really interested in intelligence; they're interested in the results of intelligence, which means resources, basically. Being the master in the world of set theory or particle physics is not going to necessarily, at least in most cases, yield the results of that. So I'm always hesitant. I like to go with the evidence, and going with the selfish gene. I don't think, as much as I believe in quote unquote memetics, I don't really think that even memetically you could argue that that somehow the Newtons of the world fit into the strictest interpretation of evolutionary theory, which is basically DNA replication or random mutation through natural selection. I would view these types of contributions as spandrels at best. And spandrel, for example, I believe that human language is very much you familiar with the term spandrel, right?
Yep.
Right. Human language is very much a product, a spandrel of various evolutionary processes, random mutation through natural selection, that turned out to be useful and were propagated for whatever reason. But again, language has huge social utility, and it's part of social intelligence. So, for example, having high verbal IQ is extremely beneficial. I'll give you a good example of this. Have you heard of Edward Bernays?
Yes.
Yes, he was the grand propagandist of marketer of the 20.
Public relations expert.
Yes, public. He in fact he's the one who said we can't use the term propaganda. It's connoted far too negatively. We need to use the term public relations. He was the one that got women on board with smoking and all kinds of things like that.
He also imported psychoanalysis to America.
Yeah, I believe he was the nephew of Freud. Yeah, in before, yes, he was a Jew. Whatever. I know that's going to come up. But the point is that that type of it has great social capital, verbal, and so language is related to that. If you can manipulate language, make use of it, that's really useful as well.
So, go ahead.
But the point being is that there you could argue that human language begets a very useful social intelligence or verbal intelligence, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, say the visuospatial, there's much less applicability. Newton was an absolute curmudgeon and, from my understanding, a loathsome human being to interact with. You didn't want to talk to him. You wanted to read his Principia Mathematica, and that was about it, and move on with your day.
There's actually a good reason to believe that when it comes to language itself, the brain is already kind of pre-wired, pre-adapted in some ways to handle language processing and to be good at it. So we might even think of this in some sense, the ratio of the long range and the short range connections, for instance, a certain ratio of them may be optimal for language processing, and as we deviate further and further away from that, our language processing skills decrease, although other skills may increase, such as being a savant who creates physics.
Because I would argue, and I agree, but I would argue because language is much more of a general intelligence factor. So you look at programming languages. They're very simple compared to human language. I mean, language by definition has a syntax, but programming languages, and I'm not hardly an expert, but they do not have the complicated syntax, or for that matter, phonology of human language.
Now, that said, programming languages are much more difficult to read. We can read the language, like we can read English or the languages that we speak fluently, but even the best programmers need to sit and parse through to find out
I would
what
actually
the code
disagree
is
with
doing.
that. We need to be, language as an oral phenomenon. We need to be taught to read and write, and some people struggle with it. Look at dyslexia.
Yes, yes, I should.
And it's highly dependent on the writing system. It takes at least a decade to become decently proficient in, say, Chinese characters, Hansu as they call it, these ideograms. So I'm somewhat reluctant to use written language I mean, programming languages are artificial languages, but the syntax that they use, from my limited understanding, is much more repetitious, and there are, I don't want to get all linguisticy here, but there are quote-unquote fewer exceptions. Human language is just chock full of all kinds of weird rules, and then interruption of the rules, and so because human language is seemingly erratic, although for decades people have been superficially it's seemingly erratic. There are all kinds of theories to account for that's actually not the case, but I won't go into syntax theory here because it would bore everybody. I used to be involved in syntax years ago, but this because it's so erratic superficially, this would account for the need for a general intelligence to comprehend it. Whereas if you have repetitious syntactic patterns in a programming language, compared to human language at least, a narrow intelligence would be much better equipped to comprehend that. I would argue.
Absolutely, I think that's exactly right. And I guess going back to the evolutionary perspective of why we might be seeing more narrow intelligence, with all the assortative mating, that is the intelligent people mating with the intelligent people, the dumb people mating with the dumb people. Or I guess sorry, that I shouldn't have put it like that. The specific intelligence people mating with the specific intelligence, and the general intelligence mating with the general intelligence. As our population grows, we're going to see stratification and a kind of neurodiversity. We're going to have some people who do have very specific intelligence and some people who do have very general intelligence.
We already see this. Charles Murray, in his book Coming Apart. You know Charles Murray, Bell Curve, must know that. Right?
Oh, yes.
Right. He wrote a bunch of books, one Coming Apart, I think it was in 2012. Anyway, it was into the 21st century. And he talks about, among other things, about the emergence of a cognitive elite and the social stratification, specifically of the United States. But we see this already, I think, in smaller corners of the world. So, for example, on the Discord server where we met, which I refer to as the cafe, it's very obvious that the population there is already stratified. So if you're this happened I think the other day, right? We had, for lack of a better term, a bunch of smooth brains who could only troll and talk about whatever they like talking about, and then a group of other people who wanted to talk about more complex issues. This is manifest all over the place. Now, in former times, you wouldn't have had access to these people. I mean, birds of a feather flock together. But the concern of Charles Murray is, with the emergence of the cognitive elite, I think Silicon Valley is kind of the prototypical example of this, is that in contrast to what alt-righters would claim, I mean, race is not or ethnicity is not the major factor here. The major factor is G in general, and then specialization in some cases in Silicon Valley, and then you see that the major factor in quote unquote uniting people or getting people together is that G factor, in as much as most people who are heavily G-loaded would prefer to associate with other. I call this a sort of friendship or a sort of befriending. It's my own whatever neologism, but because would a super G-loaded person rather hang out with a Thomas Sowell, despite him being heavily melanated, as Negroid Dinkelbergstein might say, or white trailer trash from Alabama? I would hesitantly say the former. This creates all kinds of issues in society because the needs and wants of high G-loaded people who are narrowly specialized are oftentimes, apart from the bottom rung of the hierarchy of needs, very different from the needs and wants of people far below that. Just before the talk, I was getting my morning coffee in the kiosk, and as usual, there were ruddy-cheeked, drunken Germans, drunk already at 8:30 in the morning, and they were talking, I think, about football. If I try to ignore what they're saying, but football with the kiosk owner, and these are
men colliding.
Yeah, right, man, right, and so it used to be, I would argue, it used to be to a greater extent ethnic, racial, cultural. We could call this also cultural collision or conflict. But increasingly, I think going forward, the major conflict, particularly in the United States, is a conflict of, you could almost argue, cognitive interests. And we have to be honest with ourselves that the vast majority of people, if you look at this in terms of a Gaussian curve or wave, they're going to be somewhere in the middle, somewhere. And de facto, even if you're somewhere in the middle and not far to the left on this Gaussian curve, you're going to be, the interests and the relatedness of people in that cognitive elite are going to be, well, unattainable, incomprehensible, etc. They might as well be aliens. And I have encountered personally, I'm somebody who probably is somewhere to the right of the bell curve, but I'm not that bright. And I've encountered these people that are just in the stratosphere, and they are as alien to me as I might be to your typical smooth brain who's only interested in the football game and drinking beer. And I know you're not. We can get into this maybe, but just using IQ as a proxy, 2 standard deviations above me, and already these people oftentimes they're fucking aliens. Just as the drunken German in the queue talking about the football match is an alien to me, and I'm an alien to him. This is, I think, the number one issue going forward, because I don't want to talk too much about alt-right and all these internet battles between liberalists, but people talk about social cohesion. But the evidence, I think, is very much indicative of what I would call a sort of befriending or a sort of association. Birds of a feather flock together, yes. But what is the most important thing? I would say common interests and the ability to comprehend one another. And if you cannot comprehend one another, whatever your ethnic background or racial profile, you're going to be at a loss. And I think Charles Murray is absolutely on the money when he's primarily concerned with this social division and stratification. And I mean, it's not even off topic; it's all related. What do you do? I mean, I'm going to be generous and say that people in the middle are more generalized. Although, again, I think using G loadedness as a proxy as well, that even most G loaded people, apart from autists, they have better general intelligence as well.
Yeah. You can have like a good general intelligence and weak general intelligence, and weak narrow intelligence and strong narrow intelligence.
Yeah.
Like there are innate levels, but the type of things that people will tend to learn, if they're these different kinds of learners, will either be general or specific.
Yeah.
Or somewhere in the middle.
And I don't think this is, again, we're all in these internet discussions, and even in policy, we're all bogged down in discussion of the primitive. What I think are things are primitive political ideologies and primitive, racial ideologies. This is the big thing, and I hate to invoke the great demigod Jordan Peterson, but he did have an interesting anecdote of some guy whom he tried to help with an IQ somewhere in the 80s, and I'm paraphrasing here. I think he managed to get him a volunteer job that involved, I think, just sorting out letterheads on envelopes, and he couldn't do it. And so calculations of 15% of the American population is somewhere in that range. That's tens of millions of people. And then let's talk about the broad average, people who could do that, as we move to increasing specialization. Because here's the thing, most of these people who have low general intelligence, or in the say average IQ quadrant, they're not... they're not, frankly speaking, ever going to be the idiot savants. So I think this is of great concern. Furthermore, if you want to extrapolate from that in terms of politics, I think this is one of the reasons why politics has become, I guess you could argue it's always a dirty game, but just such a transparently dirty game these days, is because the ability of politicians, who on average are smart, to relate to their constituents is narrowing and disappearing. Increasingly, it's like feeding pigeons breadcrumbs, right? It's just, there's no sense of human relatedness there, because I won't universally argue, but on average, a good, cunning politician will be part of, at the very least, a cognitive superior, if not elite, compared to the majority of his constituents, with a few exceptions. This creates a rift and a fissure that is irreparable, in my view, and increasingly will become ever more so moving forward. And I don't see people really addressing this. Now, these days, the name of the game is talking about racial conflict, or it's been re-invoked by many people on the alt-right.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, I think, a much bigger issue. If you cannot fundamentally relate to someone because we're living quite almost literally in different dimensions, that is, our comprehension of the dimension we call the universe is completely different, what do you do? And the only redress here is then to fundamentally alter the cognition of the human being through genetic engineering or manipulation. There's CRISPR, and we can talk about that, which would require a much more profound understanding of molecular genetics. Cue the trout and tea. Yes, you actually do need to find the genes, because most genetic properties are polygenic for this sort of thing. The cognitive rift is I think, the major, and I mean going forward the next century or two, going to be huge. Because I don't even know if we have the resources to uplift all the people, just say the average people or the slightly above average people to that level. And what you'll end up with is a kind of, have you seen that cheesy film Elysium with Matt Damon, these sort of these people that...
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Yeah, I skimmed through it, and you get that kind of scenario of these people just living off on their own in some... I mean, literally in their own dimension, pretty much. And then other people just, the ants, as it were, living on the ground. And this is very alarming and disconcerting, because social cohesion is completely disrupted by that. And I think far more, although people could frame it along racial lines, long term, far more, this will be the issue, because if you have a group of rulers, de facto rulers for lack of a better term, who have no relationship to you whatsoever cognitively, different interests, do different things, who are basically just feeding you breadcrumbs because you are the filthy losers and rotters of society, that is much more... I mean, we've seen echoes of this in former times. The tyranny of autocratic kingdoms, etc. It's not exactly the same thing, because in former times, the cognitive stratification and divisions, these were much lesser and far less profound. But we've seen where that leads, where you have some ruling elite that just doesn't relate to, or in the former times, refuses to relate to the general populace. In our time and in going forward, we're going to have a population that simply cannot. They will just, by their very nature, not be able to relate to that. They will understand the behavioral mechanisms, so they can manipulate it. And this is what we're seeing in the sort of the transparently dirty politics of our time. Constituents that cannot relate to the political representatives, and vice versa. I think in Justin Trudeau's case it's questionable, but still, to invoke your main man there. But
it's true, absolutely. I mean, as our population density grows and we have more stratification, more like the end result is either balkanization or conflict. And
yeah.
I can scarcely predict how we might actually balkanize, although as politicians need to begin, they're appealing to the lowest possible common denominator, the most vague thing that offends no one and has some slight appeal to everyone in order to stay popular. As that becomes no longer effective, how exactly will we divide the nation? Will it be along racial lines? I mean, it could be, if that's what's important to people at the time. If we have like centers of intellectual elite, will they balkanize? And in 50 years, what will the population of America look like? Right now we have, or America has, slowing population growth rates, but new technology changes, climate change might not hit so bad. Maybe there will be 2 billion people in America in 100 years. Is it possible to have that many people with that much diversity, that much stratification under one government? Maybe not. Probably not, I would say.
No, I mean, what I think the long-term strategy for holding the rebellious masses at bay, I think, has always been various forms of entertainment. I mean, I'm repeating myself here. I've talked about this in the past, but you look at Rome. As Rome was collapsing and decaying, the way you kept the rabble, for lack of a better term, contented was providing them with as much entertainment as possible in the ludi, the gladiatorial games.
Give them games and give them bread.
Right. We do the same thing these days. We have porn, we have video games, we have internet nonsense, entertainment, internet blood sport. The masses are entertained. And I think, and this is in contrast, I mean, this is where we actually might see something that will buck the historical trend here in this specific case, because unless the internet collapses, in which case it's game over. But that there, I hate to use the term relative perpetuity, but we might be able to maintain a system of ludi, Roman gladiatorial games or entertainment, in relative perpetuity, such that the masses never catch on because they simply don't care, because they're too distracted by all the distractions in their lives, the entertainment, their sex, their pleasurable food. I just did a talk with Wojak about sugar. All these things will serve to just numb them, or rather benumb them to the reality of this increasing stratification, and the cognitive elites will know just what's happening. And in fact, we know this. I'll give you a good example of this. In my recent talk about sugar, there was a campaign, I believe, related from Coca-Cola, claiming that it's indeterminable if sugar is the actual thing and a calorie is a calorie. Now, we know now that a calorie is not a calorie by definition, because a calorie, depending on its macronutrient classification, is processed by the body very differently. A carbohydrate is processed differently from a fat calorie, etc. So that's just factually incorrect. And by invoking the vaguest terms of thermodynamics, they're trying to... And so we already know that the people who are quote-unquote ruling over us, they know all these things. They're manipulating people. But I think that for the broad mass of people, it just doesn't really matter. And so, social stratification aside, if these elites for decades and decades to come, and I think, barring the destruction of the internet, they could maintain this perpetual hedonic treadmill, as it were, it won't really matter. The elites will be working on their own projects. They will be as aliens to the common man, but here's the caveat, which bucks the historical trend. As I always talk about in my videos, so I'm being repetitious, perhaps needless. So without resource deprivation, you won't have any of these issues. So give the common person his porn, his Skittles, his Domino pizza, his fucking Call of Duty, and you're pretty much good to go. And I think, if this continues, then you might not see these acts of rebellion that used to characterize every form of quote-unquote disconnect between ruling minority and ruled over majority.
Yeah, and this goes straight into the other subject that we wanted to get into, which was, I guess the one of the central issues that will define it is, can we keep up the productivity growth that we currently have in order to keep this treadmill actually turning? Because as the population grows, we need more and more technology. Like there are a limited number of resources. We need better ways to get the resources, more efficient technologies, in order to essentially keep up with all these games and bread. And so how we manage the scientific research and development industry has a lot to do with how productive our technological advancements will be. And so very much like the dilemmas with any complex system, we have these sets of knobs here, like how to distribute scientific funding, and we can turn many of them, and we're not sure exactly what would be most optimal. There are a few emerging trends, though. Of late, governmental funding for science is in decline. Starting in the 40s, prior to, I guess, America entering World War II, almost all science in America was privately funded. It was done through philanthropy and by venture capitalists of the day. When the war broke out, the National Science Foundation was created, and they basically swept up a bunch of scientists into a defense research and development program in order to get technology for the war. That was very, very beneficial. They developed a lot of things, although it was also inefficient in some ways. One guy who was a genius rocket scientist who came up with using gyroscopes and invented liquid fuel for rockets, they took him and told him to invent the bazooka. And he did invent the bazooka, but he would have been much more valuable if he had been left to his rocket science. Had they known at the time, they probably would have done so. So since the rise of the NSF, most of the funding for science in America has been from public tax-paying dollars until about, I think, the 90s, when it dipped below half and has been in decline ever since. Since then, corporate research has been dominating, and they tend to research more the development side rather than the kind of pure science research. They're looking for things that will pay off in the market in the near term, which is good for productivity. But there's this other aspect to science where we don't exactly know what the benefits of pure science will be down the road. It's impossible to know what advancements we'll get from the Large Hadron Collider until we actually do it. So there's this balance between allowing the market to invest in things and instead organizing their money for directed interests. There are pros and cons with both sides, but I would say that there's a definite need for national funding of pure sciences, but we also must rely on the free market for productive and usable scientific research developments that can actually keep the productivity going.
Yeah, and this is dovetailing well with the free market itself, which we want to talk about. Even though you seem to be a free market absolutist, I believe in the past you've conceded that sometimes directedness, as it were, it can be useful. You will be the first to concede, I would imagine, that the free market produces enormous amounts of waste. For example, my favorite one is always women's handbags. I don't really see, or high heels. I mean, you could argue it gives them greater sexual capital, but whatever. I don't find that particularly useful from my perspective. The sugar industry. What is the free market solution to long-term health and aging and disease? It is the sugar industry, which is, I wouldn't say single-handedly, but almost single-handedly ruined the health of huge sectors of the population in North America and increasingly throughout the rest of the world. That is the free market at work. They understand the biochemistry behind it, and they use it to manipulate people, and they use it to ruin people's lives. That's also the free market. Now, everything is a cost-benefit, and everything is trade-off. If you had, it must be very cold over there since you're rubbing your hands. But everything is a trade-off, and so, I mean, you could say that, yeah, this is one of the downsides, but the free market also gave us the internet and computers. I'm not really sure what, to my mind, as a non-economist with some knowledge, a mixed market economy seems to be best, where you have some directedness and otherwise some degree of laissez-faire. And I suppose people will, cue them for calling me the irredeemable centrist here on this matter, at least. But I think that's what the evidence shows, because completely do whatever you want leads to women's handbags, sugars, Twix, Skittles, Twix, and cheap chocolate chip cookies. And on the other hand, top down, well, we saw how it worked. We saw how it worked out with the Soviet Union, although there were some successes in the Soviet Union. So let's take a look at China. I'm not going to get too much into this, but China is very interested in genetic research. Now, they're interested in it in a very teleological sense, in the sense that they want to achieve something with it. Now, you could also argue in the West that genetic research is teleological, but they want to create the super babies. They are researching the genomic components of intelligence. They're on it. They're working at it. Now, it's very much directed. Because they're not as much guided by the sort of do whatever you want free market policy, the government's heavily involved. From my understanding, they're hiring people from outside of China or employing them or whatever. They're probably going to achieve greater results than the sort of random, willy-nilly stuff going on to some degree in the United States and elsewhere. And in the United States, it's mostly about the hereditary basis of diseases. I mean, that's going to be the first item on the list. And here we can see that the greater directedness of China will, at least in this narrow sector, produce greater results, and long term could lead to displacement in terms of global hegemonic power. Because let's say China, through their directed autocratic genetic research, 90% of it going towards intelligence research, figure some stuff out. They figure out germline editing of key genes involved in intelligence, even if it turns out to be hundreds or whatever. They figure it out. And they start applying it to their own elite, which makes them even smarter. And they say, you know what, it's going to be fucking expensive, but we're going to distribute this technology throughout the population. And using IQ as a proxy, we're going to up the average IQ by 5 throughout the population. That's actually pretty enormous if you think about where the right of the bell curve will shift, if that's the case, just theoretically. And meanwhile, Kanukistan and Murica are sort of floundering in their perhaps well-merited but insufficient research in their own sort of genetic quandaries. They're going to fall behind, and there's going to be a shift in balance. And I don't see in this particular case, and in a few others, sugar being a great one, the free market being let's just free market this. I used to be a free market absolutist in my youth. I think at your age, I'm not saying this in condescension, but just it was the case when I was a libertarian still, or libertarian-ish. Yeah, the free market will solve this. I mean, no. Distributing correct factual information doesn't solve things. We know now that sugar is a drug, for example. Doesn't solve anything. We know that, again, China's doing this stuff, Singapore to a lesser extent. There are more authoritative autocratic systems in place that are doing specific things. Now, in some cases, they're going to lose out on certain things. But what are they going to be losing out on? They're probably going to be losing out on the surplus trash that is produced by the free market. So anyway, I've said my piece on that.
I mean, I do largely agree with you. I'm definitely not a free market absolutist. I would say, but rather than the economic sense, I do see the value of markets themselves.
So do I. But that's why I'm arguing for the complexity of our current day and age, a mixed market system with
Absolutely.
priorities and lesser priorities.
In the most sophisticated neural networks or complex systems, you have top-down influence as well as bottom-up influence. The benefit of the market is that you have all these autonomous nodes that can adapt in real time, much better in ways that are much better than a central organizer. But when you have the central organizer that happens to know something about which direction we should all be heading in, that top-down influence can be itself very beneficial. In order to program successful, narrow, intelligent AIs, we have to give top-down instruction. We can't. It's not just fully abstract. If we want to program it to beat Tetris, then we need to program it beforehand to be able to understand what the score is, for instance. So when we have specific goals that we need to achieve, like China's genome project, it is very beneficial, I think, to gather the greatest minds, but you can't exactly tell them what to do. You have to essentially put them in a room and let them decide for themselves how they're going to proceed. You still need that internal market of scientists. For instance, when the NSF was created, President Truman was insisting that we distribute science funding based on population size, so each state gets however much money according to how much tax they put in. But Vannevar Bush, the head of the R&D DoD department, insisted that it had to be scientists deciding which other scientists would get the money. So they created like anonymous peer review systems in order to have a competitive market within scientific organizations and within the scientific community overall. So I think it is very beneficial that we can come together for specific projects that helps greatly with specific advancements that we need to make. But overall, we can't do it for all aspects of the economy, certainly. We do need some free market. The free market is great for just raw productivity. It may not always be the best kind of productivity. It tends to eventually get things right. We've suffered from sugar for quite a while, but I think that in the future we will, the knowledge that it is bad will eventually win out. We will move away from it. So we do definitely need a mix. It would be really hard for me to say exactly where that ratio lies. It's too complex, but we definitely need organized public funding of pure sciences in ways that's not just tell them to invent the bomb or solve the genome. Like, we can't micromanage them, is what I'm saying. But we also do need a broader community, so to speak.
I mean, one way around this is not really the right term. I can't think of anything else at the moment. It's still too early. One way around this is incentivizing public interest in scientific research for quote-unquote good causes like Alzheimer's research by appealing to their quote-unquote humanity. I think the masses, the unwashed masses, tend to work off a pure emotion. And so many, if you have a relative who suffered from X disease, whatever, you may or may not be concerned, but many will be concerned. They will invest money. Another way, I used to talk about this with a deceased friend who was an aging geneticist. How do you increase interest in aging genetics and improvements in that field and line of inquiry? Well, you appeal to women's vanity and say, well, if we get this done, you'll at 40 you can look like you were at 20 or something like that. And women control the majority of the purse strings in I think 70% of financial assets in the United States. So they would just throw their money at that. Sure, that would be feeding the primitive vanity of female kind, but at the same time, you would have greater funding towards certain projects. So there's a way in which you can manipulate the public vis-a-vis the free market that will actually be beneficial long term to important projects that involve health, disease, even intelligence in some sense. But at the moment, but that is a kind of somewhat, it's kind of a mixture of top down and a mixture of just spontaneity. At the moment, I think one of the issues is what I call the absolute profit model, in which the only thing that matters is satisfying shareholders. I've seen this particularly in the video game world, where that's the case, where games have lost their creativity, their goodness, as it were, because of the absolute profit model. Specifically, as you mentioned earlier, we don't know what scientific discovery or any discovery of knowledge will bring in the future. For example, someone could say, well, studying entomology is completely useless because ants and what's the point? Then all of a sudden, who knows? I'm completely speculating. I'm probably talking my ass, but maybe 100 years.
I can think of many applications already, actually.
Well, certainly in terms of ant societals. There are benefits to understanding this. For example, entomology is great for understanding complex systems, right? In terms of insect hierarchies and things like that. But let's just say that they discover some rare wasp and it has some venom and it can be used in some treatment of some really horrible disease. We don't know. And so the absolute profit model, I think, interferes with this because it is prohibitive by its nature, because it's all well and good if for whatever reason entomology, just as some subfield of entomology became really profitable, but if it's not, you just cut it out. If X becomes non-profitable, you cut it out. And there's no way to predict whether or not X, Y, or Z at some point in time might have been useful or not useful. And the absolute profit model, which is the free market principle of satisfying shareholders, I would say interferes with potential. It also interferes, I think, with passion and creativity, because, and this is my own bias, again invoking the gaming world, where I see passion and creativity snuffed out by, I don't have a problem with greed, but excessive greed, avarice. I think EA is a great example of that. I don't want to get too much into that. Okay, so the EA story.
Yes.
Just downsizing, destroying companies, like a huge oceanic leviathan, just eating things up, spitting them out. The
new DLC loot crate profit model especially disturbs me.
Yeah, DLC loot crate profit model. They destroyed BioWare, arguably, although there was a lot of SJWs going on there too. But other company, I'm trying to think of some other companies they had under their wing that they downsized or just completely devoured. It's just eat them up, get some money out of them, spit them out. But I think this could be applicable to anything else. There's no incentive, for example, with the sugar issue.
There's anti-incentive.
Yeah, because sugar, it's really palatable. We know why people become addicted to sugar. Like I said, there have been now animal studies showing that it basically is a gateway drug, that people who have sugar addiction are more susceptible to other things like formal drug addiction, alcoholism, etc. If all you have is the absolute profit model, then why would you shift that when you can just endlessly feed people? I go to the kiosk, I see people, all they buy is sugary drinks. So it's because it works. If something works, they're going to keep it. Why is EA still in business? Well, people don't have the will, for better or worse, to stop supporting the games that they publish. It works, and so they stay in business and they stay in existence. I don't see a way around this absolute profit model.
No, you're absolutely right, and this applies. There's actually a trend, as I said earlier. Corporate research firms are closing down labs that investigate kind of pure science, and they're moving more towards anything that's profitable. And this is a fair crisis. They're still using contemporary pure research, but they're just funding it less and less. Fewer really high quality journals are putting out fewer articles, but these articles are more impactful. That can't hold out forever. So yeah, we absolutely do need public funding in order to fill in the gaps of
yes,
where
but on the
philanthropy can.
On the topic of public funding, many discussions with people actually involved in science. Public funding has its pitfalls too, and this is where I think we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place, because in the case of public funding, you basically have public funding, because it's so directed, and there's certain things that people don't want to touch on for whatever reason, whether it's politically correct or incorrect, or it's just not what's going to be funded. People need to write research grant applications in a very in a way that is artificial. It creates a dependency and destroys the creativity and spontaneity that could exist in a more free market, laissez-faire system. And so I don't see a way around this. I think in terms of scientific research in general, we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Relying on public funding is, once again, to some extent, the people who give the public funding, whether they're taxpayers or politicians, I mean, they don't know shit, and so they're not going to be the people who are going to be most informed on certain subjects. It's a huge quagmire, and I don't really see a way around this.
Well, I mean, we do have one saving grace. We do have the quality of the scientific community as a whole. The head scientists at the NSF who are responsible for selecting anonymous peer reviewers, they do a fairly good job of creating a market. There is obviously some risk of
peer
slag,
review system. Again, I've had someone on is pretty messed up. There's so much venality and corruption there.
It is, but at least it's not politicians deciding which scientists get the grant. That would be even worse.
I suppose, yeah. It might be minimally better, but again, we have this issue with human ego as well that plays hugely into peer review and what have you.
That's definitely true. I mean, it's like it is really a complete strategic dichotomy, a dilemma. We could either there are many pros of the free market. There are many pros of more organized effort. There are cons of the free market. There are cons of organized effort. And really, having both approaches available and even having them compete, if that were possible, is probably the ideal. Is probably what we have to have, and that is what we have. In fact, I would say right now, though, we need a little bit more public funding because the for-profit model is beginning to create crises in the research industry. The development industry is doing great.
And beyond QEA. I mean, not just within I agree with you, but it really is everywhere in the free market, the absolute profit model being... Absolutely. And there's no like one theory or understanding that gets at it all, because these are very complex systems, and so it's many relationships, hierarchies, feedback loops. It's more or less unpredictable. Yeah, and I think, and as we move towards the end, because it's very late there where you are, and I don't want to keep you up needlessly, I think people have an issue being at peace with what I would call problematicity, which is to say, there are things that are problematic, and there will always be things in any given system that will be problematic. I'm not so sure we'll ever get to the point where we can, you used earlier the term irreducible complexity. I don't like the term irreducible complexity, but let's say for the purposes of the human mind, complex systems are, by their very nature, irreducibly complex. And do not think we're going to get to the stage where we can figure it all out. And the consequence of not being able to figure it all out is that there will be this problematicity to every system in place, and we might not have solutions. There may not be a solution. We may not be able to come up with a better solution to the absolute profit model or the corruption venality in public-funded research and human psychological issues. It might just be that for the nonce, this is pretty much the best we can come up with, and I think that's a hard pill to swallow. We like to problematize things. We like to figure things out, but I think, God, I don't want to invoke. I'm not going to invoke Hegel. That's just. We can look at historical processes as a kind of slow work towards synthesis of some sort, and many things have been tried in the past and other things have not. But this sort of lopsided, mixed market, whatever the hell it is you want to call it, we have now, might be, for all its deficiencies, deficits, faults, the best thing we can come up with now, and one that's inherently dissatisfying to many people who think they know it better, and two, it raises people's cackles, because then you're just thinking, well, we really can't come up with anything better than this. And I feel frustrated with it too. I see so many. We all see we see so many problems with society and the world. But sometimes you just you can't fight City Hall. And let's just swap City Hall here with the problems of our universe. We're up against forces that are, in some sense, titans, and we are the ants, and I don't know if we can outbox the titans here. That would be those would be my thoughts on it. That people call that defeatist, but it's more just an acceptance of what is, rather than needlessly expending energy railing against a universe that will probably in the end remain, at least for the current human mind, irreducibly complex, and everything derivative of it, that is the planet Earth and the systems we create as a consequence. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I'd broadly agree. I mean, the lopsided mixed economy that we do have, I would say, is the least toughest pill to swallow, and I do, by irreducible complexity, maybe one day we will be able to actually chart all these systems, but as we sit now, trying to predict, what would actually be better would be like an ant trying to predict what the ideal colony would look like, what the ideal anthill would look like. The anthill has to emerge from bit by bit, slow incremental improvements, in the same way that in complex systems, autonomous nodes, slowly adapt and form higher forms of complexity. So, the gaps in our knowledge, we can't make predictions about it until we actually get there, until we arrive at that cusp. I take solace in the fact I do believe that we are making steady progress. We're making excellent progress in terms of understanding the world. I'm excited by the mystery. I mean, so what if I'm an ant who can't understand everything? We've already accomplished a great deal, and we are getting somewhere. We don't have simple answers, but maybe the universe wouldn't be interesting if things were simple.
There is no silver bullet, and I think all the evidence goes against the idea that there will be a silver bullet solution to any of this. Again, a final note, boycotting in the gaming industry, say EA, nobody can't even muster the will to do it. So, I even though that would be a simple solution, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty,
Ideally,
yeah,
that's how it's
ideally.
supposed to work.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a completely separate discussion, and I think that we could have that discussion at some point in time at another date. The loss, we could maybe phrase along the lines of the loss of public awareness and public action. There was a time when people were much more involved in things, and I think one of the reasons, and I don't want this will be a separate discussion, why you have this loss is because of the perpetual entertainment cycle. People, they're just too distracted to even care. But that's a separate discussion, and I need to refine my ideas on that. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Flimflamm, the great Canuckistanian that he is, has a weird sleeping schedule. Nonetheless, it is very, very late where he is, and I'm sure he is approaching limits due to his human limitations of his own coherence. Although I don't want to prejudge you on that. I'm assuming you're quite tired and probably need to get some sleep.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So everyone, thank you for joining. I'd like to get him on again. As you can tell, he's a fairly articulate and knowledgeable Canuckistanian. And yeah, it was great talking to you. And I will check out the audience and Flimflamm later. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.